Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is week 2 of Advocacy in Action, a 5-part series presented by the National Trust for Historic Preservation Leadership Forum and the Main Street America Institute. So glad that we could have attendees come back with us for the second session of this series. This is, as I mentioned, one part of a 5-part series. You have access to each of the week's programs via your InReach account. And after each week of the program, there is a short quiz to complete should you want to pursue this course for credit towards the Main Street America Institute's Leadership Development Certificate. So please make sure if you proceeded through the first webinar of the course, that you completed the quiz for webinar 1. You should see complete in your InReach account next to that week of the course. The same will go for week 2 here. And should you complete all 5 weeks, that will earn you credit, certificate of completion for this course that will help you earn towards leadership development course or leadership development certificate. And we will provide you more information about future opportunities in that path. With that, I'm going to turn things over now to our moderator for today's program. I'd like to introduce you to Amanda Elliott. Amanda is the Senior Program Officer and Director of California Programs at the National Main Street Center. She is responsible for delivering comprehensive commercial district revitalization technical services to communities and coordinating programs across the country. And she acts as the director of the California Main Street program, which is currently administered through Main Street America. So Amanda, I'm so grateful that you could be here today to help guide this conversation, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Well, hello, everyone. Excited to join you today for this webinar and this session. Many of us have lots of questions about the difference between advocacy and lobbying, and hopefully we'll get to answer some of those questions today, especially on behalf of ourselves and our organizations. There's lots of fear and misunderstanding surrounding the subject. So really happy to be learning more myself as a representative of our nonprofit in California. And today I'm joined by Ross Bradford, who will present the presentation today, and also Julie Fitzpatrick and Aaron Tobin, and we're going to have a discussion a little later. Ross is the Deputy General Counsel for the National Trust, and Julie is Executive Director for Pennsylvania Downtown Center. Aaron Tobin serves as the Preservation League's Vice President for Policy and Preservation. There is an advocacy campaign underway right now for National Main Street, and we want to know how we can support that. A lot of us have a lot of questions around that, and again, some fear and trepidation. So hopefully we can get to some of those things. So Ross is going to lead us through the presentation, and Ross again is the Deputy Counsel for the National Trust for Historic Preservation and has provided legal counsel to the organization for over 16 years. He delivers a broad range of legal services, including lobbying, compliance at the federal, state, and local levels of government, and provides strategic guidance and support for advocacy-related matters related to the National Trust collection of historic sites and the National Trust campaign for American National Treasures. He also supervises the National Trust Preservation Easement Program and oversees gifts of real estate transactions for the organization. He received his BA in Political Science and English Literature from Emory University and a JD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So welcome everybody, welcome Ross, and he's going to take it away with the presentation, and we will see you a little bit more in our discussion time. Thank you, Ross.
Thank you, Amanda. It's good to be with you all today. I'm going to turn off my camera and we're going to start with the presentation. The first thing we'll start off with is a general outline of what we're going to talk about today. Can nonprofits lobby? What is lobbying? Examples of lobbying, state and local lobby issues, and then we'll have the rest of the panelists talk about examples from the field, and we'll close out with some questions and answers. Before we get started, we are in an election year, and so it's always important to point this out, but nonprofits are prohibited from what's called political campaign intervention. And so we're going to be talking about lobbying on this call, but I just wanted to drop that as a footnote that nonprofits are absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elective public office. We could have a whole webinar about what that means and how the IRS views that, and but that's a topic for another day, or happy to answer questions about that at the end. But we're going to move on to lobbying, and basically we're going to talk about how the IRS views lobbying for nonprofits, and we're also going to talk about the federal compliance standards and also state and local issues. But the big takeaway from today's conversation should be that nonprofits can lobby, and they should be out there lobbying and advocating for their organization's interests. And lobbying is a thing that nonprofits have been doing for many, many years, and there's lots of great resources out there on the internet that talk about how nonprofits can lobby. The primary interface with lobbying and lobbying compliance, first and foremost, comes with compliance with the IRS requirements. So if you are going to lobby and you are a nonprofit, you have to play by the IRS's rules. And so the IRS basically says that nonprofits can lobby, provided that no substantial part of their activities are attributed to propaganda or influencing legislation. And so you might be wondering, well, what does that mean? And the real key parts to this are, basically, if you're a nonprofit, you can't, a substantial part of your business should not be lobbying. It should be a minor part of your business is the takeaway. And so there are two general tests that are used to evaluate that the IRS uses. The first one's called the substantial part test, and it's a very vague test. It's a facts and circumstances analysis, and it is intentionally vague and sometimes hard to understand and hard to apply. But under the substantial part test, basically, you have to make your case to the IRS that what you're doing is, in terms of lobbying, is not a substantial part of your business activities. And so the general rule of thumb that practitioners rely on is no more than 3 to 5% of your expenses should be related to lobbying. And I would say generally that much larger organizations might use the substantial part test because it gives them a little bit more flexibility to lobby. The vast majority of folks that we work with use what's called the Expenditure Test or the 501H election to guide their lobbying activities. And the reason why that is because the IRS has set up a very clear roadmap for the amount of money a nonprofit can spend in a given year and not run afoul of the general prohibition on not having a substantial part of your activities be part of be lobbying. And in order to apply the expenditure test, a nonprofit needs to file a specific form. It's called Form 5768. It's a one-page form. It's very easy to file. And basically, when you file that form, it lets the IRS know that you're going to abide by the expenditure test. And at that point, you are free to start tracking your expenses. And all of that tracking is done on the IRS Form 990. I believe it's Schedule C. And basically, each year you go through and you note how much money you're spending generally on lobbying and specifically grassroots. And the IRS has a chart that kind of guides nonprofits regarding the amount of money they can spend. I'm not going to go through the specifics of this on this call, but I will give you an example that will probably apply to most smaller organizations. But under the expenditure test, the IRS is primarily focused on two types of lobbying activities, direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. And in general, under the expenditure test, the most that an organization can spend on lobbying per year is $1 million. And that's for an organization that's got a budget of over 17 million. And under that maximum $1 million mark, you can spend up to 25% of that on grassroots lobbying. For other nonprofits that are smaller, let's take an example of a nonprofit that has $300,000 of revenue. Applying the IRS's rubric, that organization would be able to spend over $60,000 in a year on lobbying generally, and of that $60,000, no more than $15,000 could be spent on grassroots. So we've talked about I've mentioned two things so far: direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. You might be wondering what those things are. So direct lobbying is sort of what it sounds like. It is going out and speaking to a member of a legislative body and trying to get that person to either adopt your proposed legislation or vote for a piece of legislation or vote against a piece of legislation. I've given you a definition here, but basically it's directly influencing the decision maker, and that's what's direct lobbying. And it really involves both the actual legislative appointed person, but also their staff in many cases. And so this can take the form of direct lobbying can come in many forms, but most often it's direct one-on-one meetings, email communications. During COVID, it may be video conferencing, those types of things. I will drop a little bit of a footnote. I won't get into too much on this, but direct lobbying is typically when you are talking specifically to a member of your legislature at the state, federal, or local levels. But if your area or your locality does a lot of referendum type lobbying type activities, meaning you go to the voters to make decisions on bills or to pass bills, then anytime that you are directly engaging the public to vote on a public referendum to pass a law, that is also direct lobbying, because in that sense, the voters are sort of the legislative body, more or less. In terms of grassroots lobbying, it's a little bit more complicated. There's a three-part test for that, and basically grassroots lobbying is any communication with the public about a specific proposal where your organization expresses its view on the proposal and basically has a call to action. So anytime you send out an email blast or a tweet or a post on Instagram, and you're asking people to contact their representative, either at the state, local, or federal levels, to vote on a specific piece of legislation, and you've given the public your viewpoint on that, that's essentially grassroots lobbying. So those two things are pretty straightforward. And I've talked a lot about legislative bodies. There are, obviously, there's the executive branch and the judicial branch, and sometimes it can get a little bit murky. You might not necessarily think that, talking to someone in an executive branch at the governor's office or at the national level in the president's executive branch, whether that constitutes lobbying. And typically the answer is it doesn't. So if you were reaching out to someone in the governor's office about just a general matter of governmental affairs, that probably doesn't constitute lobbying. But if you are going to reach out to individuals, and the purpose of that is to have them influence legislators, then that might trigger a lobbying compliance issue. And the work that we do, historic preservation in particular, we often get the question, well, are administrative bodies legislative bodies? And typically the answer is no. So if you're going before a zoning board or a historic preservation review board or an architectural review board, and you're basically advocating to save a historic site or to change the local laws, that type of advocacy won't necessarily run into the lobbying realm, except that if the ultimate decision maker is, say, the city council or the local county board, once you get to a certain level in the lawmaking process, you get out of the administrative body realm and into the legislative realm, and then at that point you would be doing lobbying. There are lots of things that are not lobbying, and so sometimes people think of this as just general advocacy. And so the National Trust, for example, puts out a number of publications, Main Street does as well, about historic preservation and the values of historic preservation. But generally speaking, if you have nonpartisan analysis, research that you send out to legislators, that's okay, that's not lobbying. If you get responses for technical assistance from governmental bodies and provide them with that assistance, that's typically not lobbying. Or if you're just generally addressing broad, social economic issues and not advocating a specific legislative solution or proposal, that's not going to be lobbying. And so, like I said, we have multiple publications that we put out. I think obviously one thing you want to ask yourself is, if you're going to take the time to contact someone at the legislative branch level of government, you really want to both have your advocacy hat and your lobbying hat on, and make sure that if there is a legislative proposal that you are really wanting to have passed or are trying to defeat, that you go ahead and do the lobbying that you need to do because you can as a nonprofit and you're not prohibited from doing that. So what we've talked a lot about so far are the federal IRS sort of general lobbying compliance things. And so as a nonprofit, you need to be aware that as you're lobbying for IRS purposes, you need to be tracking your time. That means staff time. That means travel time, travel expenses, printing expenses, and time that's used to prepare for lobbying. And you need to track those in two different buckets, both a direct lobbying bucket and a grassroots bucket. And you'll want to track those throughout the year, and use your judgment as to the amount of how finite that tracking is, or how fine that tracking is, or how granular it is. And basically, at the end of the year, you'll compile all that data and you'll put it into your 990 for filing. And assuming you are within the reporting ranges, you basically file those numbers and you're fine and good to go, and you move on to the next year and do more lobbying in the future. Lobbying compliance at the state and local level is a little different. It's very similar to some of the issues and concepts that the IRS uses, but there are some peculiarities around lobbying at the state and local level, and some places have very robust lobbying laws and requirements. I would say generally that the compliance at those levels is meant to be pretty user-friendly. And so the purpose of that is really to make sure that the public knows who is talking to the people who are making decisions about laws in their town, their county, or their state. And so a lot of these registrations are available online fairly quickly after they've been made, and they're basically sunshine laws. And so you shouldn't be worried about having to file registrations or think that because you're filing a registration or being deemed a lobbyist that that's a bad thing. Lots of people make these registrations, and it's just part of the process for creating or changing laws. And so I wouldn't be afraid of that, but just be aware that you do need to look into your state or local laws about what triggers registration. And then a lot of times, because they're not uniform, the big concept here is that usually if you spend a certain amount of money, you are required to register, or if someone on your staff has spent a certain amount of time, typically that triggers registration. The good thing is across all 50 states and in most cities and counties, the places that have lobbying registration requirements, they have a lot of good resources on the Secretary of State websites or the county government websites that really walk you through this process. And oftentimes it's maybe a 1 or 2 page form. Sometimes there may be some tracking of expenses. But basically, they're focusing on, what contacts are you making, or what kinds of expenses are you spending to, directly influence public officials. So again, it's not something to be scared or afraid of, but it's just something to be mindful of and to look into before you start doing it, and to to be strategic about it. So at the state level, there are obviously 50 states and 50 different laws, but some general kind of examples, and these are very high-level examples, and there's a lot more details here that I won't go into, but I've taken 3 general jurisdictions: California, New York, and Pennsylvania, and all 3 of those states have a general a money threshold that basically you have to exceed before you have to file as a lobbyist or a lobbying firm or as a nonprofit with in-house lobbyists. And so California, for example, if you spend more than $5,000 in a quarter, or you expect to spend more than $5,000 in a quarter, you would need to lobby. And so it could very well be the case that you could have multiple lobbying contacts within a quarter that don't breach that $5,000 threshold, and you might not need to register at all. In California, that's typically called a $5,000 filer. So that's what most organizations get. That's what most organizations trigger in terms of filing in California. New York, it's a little bit lower threshold. It's $5,000 per year, so it's a little less. And then in Pennsylvania, it's $2,500 per quarter. Some other examples that are a little bit more onerous: Tennessee. Basically, if you make a contact with someone, you have to report that. And so there's a filing process with that. And then at the local level, so be mindful, we're not just talking about the state level of government, but cities and counties like San Francisco City or San Francisco County and Milwaukee City, they also have registration requirements. And again, this is just to make sure that the public knows who's talking to their elected representatives about influencing legislation. And oftentimes, again, it comes down to the number of contacts you make and the amount of time or money you're spending. So you'll want to look into that and the different resources that are out there. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda and continue on with the presentation.
Thank you so much, Ross. That was really great information, and I think folks would like to learn more. So especially hearing what some of us are doing in the field. And again, joining me on this discussion and conversation is Julie Fitzpatrick. And Julie is Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Downtown Center, the state coordinating program for Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development for Main Street and Elm Street. It's a neighborhood district revitalization program, and with the National Main Street Center. She has been with PDC since 2005, facilitating community visioning, strategic planning, and other technical assistance to communities all over the Commonwealth. Her background is in community and regional planning and landscape architecture. And then also joining us is Aaron Tobin, and Aaron serves as the Preservation League's Vice President for Policy and Preservation, directing all aspects of the League's Public Policy and Technical Services program, and has been with the League since 2007. She works collaboratively to set and pursue a statewide policy agenda that advances historic preservation in New York State at the federal, state, and local levels, and builds and maintains a statewide coalition to assist the League in achieving its goals. Aaron also oversees the League's technical services and preservation grant programs, including oversight of the 7 to Save Endangered Properties program and all preservation workshops and community outreach. So ladies, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. And I don't know if you want to turn on your cameras. It would be great to see you. If you feel comfortable in doing that, that would be great. And also, Julie, oh, there you are, great. So we really want to learn what a lot of folks are doing in the field around lobbying and advocacy. Many Main Street programs and leaders have held annual lobbying or advocacy days, and they, go to their state and update them on the impact of their work and what they're doing. And sometimes it may include an ask specifically for their program. Have either of you participated in the advocacy or lobbying days? And if so, how was that for you? Or what are you actually doing in the field around lobbying for your cause and your organization?
Erin, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, we here at the Preservation League of New York State, we convene an annual Preservation Advocacy Day during our state legislative session, which typically runs from January through June. So we will have our Preservation Advocacy Day in March or February ahead while the legislature is planning our state budget in coordination with our governor's office. And that's an opportunity for us to bring advocates from around the state to talk to their representatives here at the state capitol about the positive things that preservation has done in their communities. So it's a little bit of that educational component of sharing good things that have happened in their communities with their elected officials. But then there is typically an ask. We have a state historic tax credit program in New York State, and over the last 3 years, we've had a variety of requests for the legislature. One was to renew that program. It was set to expire at the end of 2019, and so we asked for it to be continued. We achieved that, which was great, and then different improvements to the program over the last couple of years. And then other things as they come up. So there's often a specific bill And that's really helpful because legislators really like to have an action item, something that they feel like they can do to address the issue.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we used to have them in California. Unfortunately, we have not done them in several years. When I was executive director for our Main Street program in Richmond, I think the last time that we did that was maybe 2007 or 8. So hopefully I would like to get that started again, and we can start doing a little bit more advocacy and have our annual days. And Julie, what are you guys doing, and have you led any of those campaigns yourself?
Sure, yeah. So we're fortunate enough in Pennsylvania where we actually have a line item in our budget that supports Main Street programs. And we also have the Elm Street program, which you mentioned, Amanda, which is all around neighborhood revitalization. And so we also had an advocacy day back in like 2007 or 2008 and hadn't until last year, until 2019. We realized that we really needed to be advocating, in this case, specifically for more funds in that line item of our budget, as opposed to, other pieces. So we did have an advocacy day where we had encouraged all of our member communities, all our Main Street and Elm Street programs, to come to the Capitol and meet with our legislators. It was fun, even some of them even got to be on the Senate floor and be introduced as guests, so that was special. But what we realized in all of that was that, as Ross had mentioned earlier, it's really important for us to be very cognizant of not just the time that we spend, but all of the expenses. So in that case, we had refreshments, something you wouldn't think was a big deal, but we really had to keep track of that. We had a bunch of promotional materials and printing fees. And so all of that is included in this amount. And our accountants started, their blood pressure started to increase a little bit. And they said, you guys really need to get registered. So I recently became the executive director last July. And so our previous executive director and myself both got registered last August as lobbyists. So it does give us much more flexibility. However, there's a lot of accountability, and we do our timesheets through QuickBooks and allocate based off of different contracts and different communities, and do very detailed bookkeeping from that end. So I would say we were well positioned to be able to facilitate the kinds of reporting then that are required. I think the other piece for us is, being a statewide nonprofit, it is about our message and the kinds of positions and issues that we're advocating for, but it also gives us an opportunity then to be a better partner for some of our other state organizations, whether it's Preservation Pennsylvania or our chapter in Pennsylvania for the American Institute of Architects, our Housing Alliance. We actually have an organization that specifically deals with nonprofit associations. So it really has been able to broaden our ability to, I would say, be good partners and really good stewards of our network and our voice that we have in our communities.
That sounds great. Well, it sounds like it is process, though, as well. And there is, again, you saying accountability, and you kind of have to monitor things. So it might be more challenging, I guess, for some of our smaller organizations who maybe don't have as much, of a budget or someone to manage all of the accounting. But I guess if you're spending a certain amount of time, you really have to do it. In terms of the process of actually filling out the application and all of that, was that arduous or challenging to do at all?
It wasn't. For speaking for the Preservation League, I'm a registered lobbyist, and two of my colleagues are. And it was not very arduous. Similar to what Julie said, we have a separate line on our timesheet where we keep track of time, and we make a note. And we actually keep my colleague, our preservation policy manager, keeps a spreadsheet of all of our meetings, which is beneficial even if you're not a registered lobbyist, to make sure you remember who you talked to, what the staff person's name was, what the topic was. So it's really not too bad. Most of the housekeeping are things that would be best practices just for keeping track of what you're advocating for.
That's great.
Mhm.
Well, I think everyone knows that Main Street is currently involved in a direct grassroots lobbying for $100 million for Main Street programs, support for our Main Street coordinating programs, about $75 million, and direct support for Main Street business, $25 million. And, is this something our members should be concerned about in terms of signing a letter and forwarding it and doing those? Because I know a lot of people are, like, is this something that we can do? And do I need to register to be a part of this campaign? So if you guys want to share, or Ross, if you want to talk about that as well.
Yeah,
So
Ross, I don't want to. Go ahead.
I'll say we often have cosigners on our letters or partners in advocacy campaigns, and it's well below the threshold in even our low threshold in New York State, so far below it, because we do the work of putting the letter together. And it's certainly okay, and we drive that point home. It's certainly okay to educate your elected officials about things that are important, and when we're asking for specific legislative changes, like I said, it's a very minimal amount of time they spend.
Anybody else want to comment? And Kevin?
No, I think that's spot on. Just a simple sign on for a letter is not going to trigger most places, and it happens a lot. And you should also, to the degree that you have volunteers or other people that you work with, asking them to also send those letters in as grassroots advocacy. It doesn't cost you anything really, and it's a good way to get your voice heard from multiple people, because that's, the more people they hear from, the more likely they are to listen, hopefully.
Yeah.
Right.
Julie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think to kind of tag into both what Erin and Ross had said, it is about using volunteers and kind of the network that your organization has, and the network that the organizations within your community and within those other organizations. And, we've had staffers tell us at the state level that, the rallies and the kind of events can be successful, but what actually is more successful is that, inches of stacked papers of letters or email after email after email of support, because they know that there is that unanimous message. So really thinking beyond just your program or your individual organization, but all of the stakeholders and the constituents that you work with, and how it could impact them as well, whether it's directly or indirectly.
That's great. Just one question in terms of the lobbying. If you don't register for whatever reason, then, what are the penalties for not filing if you're found to be lobbying?
So it really depends. I'll answer generally, and then if Julie or Erin want to pick up specifics for where you guys work, it depends. Sometimes the penalties can be monetary penalties at the state or local level, and they can be punitive, unfortunately. So it's better to, my advice to folks at the National Trust and elsewhere is it's always better to file than to think that you may or may not need to file, because again, it's all about transparency at the legislative level. So, there are usually financial penalties for 990 reporting purposes. If you don't disclose, you do run some issues with your tax exempt status. So it's very important that if you are going to do any lobbying activities, that you do account for those for IRS reporting purposes, and it's required.
Good.
We've run into sometimes if we're, because we've been a governmental advocacy organization for almost 20 years, and maybe if we're between a staff, there's flexibility, always just apologize and file as soon as you realize you haven't filed. As Ross said, we always err on the side of, if we think it counts, it counts. Julie's point about expenses is a really important one. But there are monetary penalties, so yeah, it's always better to file.
Very good.
Yeah, and I think the cost to register, I'm sure it's going to vary depending on your state, but for us, it's a couple $100s a year. Okay. And, you know, again, as everyone else has said, you know, it makes a lot of sense for us as some of the larger organizations, but for so many of our local communities and organizations, they don't get anywhere close to that threshold. So, but even if you do register and you don't hit that threshold, there is reporting that's still required, but honestly, it's, you know, it's not quite as detailed, at least in Pennsylvania, unless you hit that threshold and go over. So it's not, yeah, quite as onerous.
Very good. Well, I don't know if any of you had any other closing thoughts or a thing that you wanted to share about advocacy and lobbying that you think might be helpful to our audience today.
There is something something that we do and that I was thinking about prior to this, which is this isn't necessarily lobbying for a specific bill, but that forming relationships with your elected officials before you have something to ask them for. You know, if you're a Main Street manager, inviting them to your public event, that's not lobbying. That's just education and outreach and you know, getting to know your elected officials. It's so much easier when you have that pre-established relationship. As a statewide, we make a real point to go and visit our statewide elected officials in their district office. That's something that's always very much appreciated. It's good to know district staff and Capitol staff. So those are my 2 cents on you know, engage your local, state, and federal officials, and don't forget the local ones, because having local support for a bill is also really important in convincing your state and federal officials.
That's great.
And yeah. I would build off of what Erin said, not just your elected officials, but their staff.
Yes.
A lot of times the staff actually carry over election after election, you know, even if the current legislator is no longer there. And so in many cases, they have that institutional knowledge, and the more familiarity they have with your issues, you know, I believe that they can become champions for you as well. And just, you know, it's really often an educational opportunity for them too.
Yeah.
And I would just add, you know, if you haven't gone to a lobby day or an advocacy day, just take a chance and go with friends. You know, these people are here to serve the public, and they're used to interacting with people. Obviously, go with a clear goal in mind, but try it out. I mean, you're not going to run afoul of anything or break any major laws. So you know, I think, you know, dip your toe in the water and go on a lobby day and just see what it's like, and then you'll get a sense for how it works. And as Julie said and Erin said, it's about making connections with these people. And, you know, so-and-so's chief of staff was somebody else's chief of staff. And, you know, it's a network of people that you have to network with. And the more people that you're in touch with, the more likely that they're going to listen to you and listen to your concerns.
Great. Well, thank you all for such great information, and I totally agree. And I think we're going to get our Advocacy Day back on track here in California. You know, this has been great information. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Kelly if there are any questions for our question and answer session. Thank you so much.
We do have a few audience questions that came in, and I'll just say to our audience members as well who typed in questions, some of them seem to have been answered throughout the program, such as the question, should I lobby or should I register as a lobbyist? I think we've talked about that pretty in depth. So if there is something that you're not hearing though, and you still have follow-up, please also follow up with via email, as we only have a couple of minutes here. But I do want to get a couple in. And Ross, really quickly, would you mind just kind of touching on some key differences between a 501c3, 501c4, and then to the extent that you're able to 501c6? A number of Main Street programs are 501c6s, so I think there's a question out there.
So 501c4s can lobby. It's a different sort of thing, animal, and so you can lobby. Let's talk offline. I'll get some more information to you about those different ones so that we can get some more specifics, because it is a bit different. So there are different rules.
different rules for different types of organizations. And another Roth-based question, in reporting state lobbying, does attending state level committee or commission meetings count, or just if one is called on to testify or present or interact with a commission?
Right. So just generally speaking, if you're, say there's an issue that's being heard by the state judicial commission or the state environmental commission, and you're going to provide testimony about something, that's not typically lobbying. It's typically viewed as a regulatory type of thing, or a regulatory hearing, or just generally providing comments at a public hearing. We wouldn't necessarily consider that lobbying. Now, there are some, again, the problem is at different state governments, that may trigger those things. But generally speaking, if you're just going to provide some public testimony, and you've been asked to provide public testimony or public input, typically you would be okay there.
And relative to local registration for lobbying, if you're registering to lobby to a city, and your organization is based in one city, but you're working on lobbying in another city, you would need to register for both, or just in the city that you are lobbying?
You register with who you're talking to. So if you're in Raleigh, North Carolina, and you're talking to the city council in Charlotte, and Charlotte has a registration requirement, and you're lobbying in Charlotte, then you register in Charlotte. And if you're talking to Raleigh city officials and you're lobbying in Raleigh, then you register in both places. It has to do with whoever you're talking to is who you register with, not where you are.
Great, thank you. Lots of little technical questions that have come in throughout the program, so I appreciate that. I also wanted to touch on a couple of other questions that came in just about recordings in this whole series. You are able to access the recording from last week's program via your InReach account. So if you are continuing on with our series and want to make sure that you saw the first session, it is available at mainstreet.inreachce.com. You can go there, check back to the recording, find the materials for the whole program, and complete the quiz for today's program and for the previous program. And for our next two sessions, next week's session is going to be on communicating with elected officials, and we will be focusing on elected officials from various levels of government. So we'd hope that you would be able to join us then to keep going through this program. We had a couple of more minor questions come in as well. So I think that some of this content has been covered throughout the program and want to keep with our time today. So I just want to say a special thank you to all of our presenters for today. And that is, of course, a real joy to have everyone here with us to hear about lobbying. And thank you to Amanda for moderating our session. So Erin, Julie, Ross, appreciate your time. And any last words from presenters or Amanda, I want to head it back to you now.
Great, thank you. It's been a great informational session, and I'm happy to have been able to participate. And again, I'm excited to get more lobbying happening here in California. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just offer, if anyone's interested, we do have some of our talking pieces that we've used through the years for our advocacy campaigns available on our website. And that's padowntown.org, and it's under our resource page, and it's open to the public, so you can download those. We had kind of an extensive questions that you would want to talk to your legislators about, and questions to ask them, in addition to some kind of key talking points as well. So, you know, in Main Street, it's all about ripping off and duplicating, so feel free to do that.
Yeah, thank you. All right, well, thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.